Okay, should we start? Okay, welcome everyone to this month's invited ICG talk. It's a great honor to introduce Professor Tamara Munzner to you. Tamara got his PhD and also she did his bachelor's at Stanford University, and then later on moved on to University of British Columbia, where she founded her own visualization group, which is now a very strong visualization group. Tamara was also co-chairing some of the biggest visualization conferences, InfoVis and EuroVis, and it's a great honor, as I said, to have her here. And Tamara is going to talk about dimensionality reduction. And Tamara, it's all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the kind introduction. So, good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about dimensionality reduction from several angles. So let me start with some definitions. So also a quick check. Can people in the back there hear me? Okay, great. All right, so dimensionality reduction, or DR, as I will say many times in this talk to avoid some syllables for short. So what is it? We're mapping from some high dimensional space in which we have measurements down to some low dimensional target space. So when might we bother doing this? And the answer is typically when you can't directly measure what it is that you care about. And you have a conjecture that there is some true dimensionality of the data set that's considerably lower than the dimensionality in which you happen to have gotten measurements. So this idea is often expressed through vocabulary like latent factors or hidden variables. So this is the typical use case for doing DR. So a very quick example, what's the kind of thing that might happen? Maybe there's things that are easy to measure inside, say, a human body about tumors. Say that's a 9-dimensional space you measure, and what you would really love in the perfect case is to project down that high-dimensional data set into a lower dimensional space, in this case a 2-dimensional target space, where now we've got something where we can actually visually see two very different clusters, which in this case we knew from ground truth are a malignant set and a benign set. So this is the great use case where you actually do see structure of interest in the low-dimensional projection. Now, why do people do this? And there's actually two somewhat different use cases, and I'm going to concentrate on just one of them. So it's very common in a machine learning context, for example, to do dimensionality reduction as part of a data processing pipeline, where the goal might be to improve the performance of some algorithm that's downstream. So we're thinking about this as reducing the number of dimensions we have in our data set for the goal of having an algorithm be able to perform better. And that's often because you've got some kind of a recursive dimensionality problem where you've got computational issues. That are the reason why you're doing this reduction. In contrast, a different situation is if your goal is to do data analysis in this lower dimensional space. And in particular, if you're going to have a human look at that output, that's the case of visual data analysis. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this talk. So when I said angles of attack in my title, what did I mean by that? Well, there's actually a number of different ways you could attack this problem. A very common way to do it is to design new algorithms for doing DR, to design entire systems that incorporate multiple algorithms, to have a focus of here's a user with a problem, can I design a tool to help them? Trying to figure out whether for any of those cases you've actually built something effective. And then finally, another angle of attack is to build some kind of a taxonomy to help you think systematically about the larger problem and how to characterize things, whether it be systems or algorithms or user problems and tasks. And so one of the things that I'm evangelizing here is the benefit of taking these multiple angle approaches to problems because you get this interesting parallax view of what's important and interesting, and you can have a lot of cross-pollination between these. So this work started basically with a progression of questions that I've developed, starting almost 15 years ago now, and gradually coming up with more and more questions. And one of them, the place I started, was, can we do better with algorithm design? So specifically, can we design dimensionality reduction algorithms or techniques that are better than the previous ones? And then some other questions started coming up. Can we build a system that real people can use to do dimensionality reduction? I'll give you my definition of real people a bit later on in this talk. When do people need to look at the output? So can we figure out what they need when they're doing this visual data analysis? How should they look at that output? So how do we know if the picture we're drawing is the right picture? This is a classic problem in Viz, figuring out whether you're doing what the user needs. Do any kind of automatic metrics actually match up with human perception? And then fundamentally, there's this really big question. Why do people use DR, and how do they use DR? And so this really led to even more questions. How are real people actually using the techniques that have been put forward from the literature? So do the statements about assumptions, say, about data sets, actually match up with what's happening in real-world usage? Why are they doing it? What are their goals and their tasks at a very abstract level in a way that's not domain-specific? Is it working? To what extent are the benchmarks that people are using in papers actually matching up with the use cases that people have? Are the tools actually meeting the needs of users? So these questions actually led to an ongoing project, one that we've been working on for several years now. We've been calling it Dimensionality Reduction in the Wild, and this is actually still work in progress. And what we did is we went out and talked to a lot of different users in different domains. In the wild is a buzzword from HCI that's talking about working in the field with real users rather than doing any kind of controlled experimental work in a lab. So we went out and interviewed a couple dozen people doing high-dimensional data analysis from many different domains. And this was over a few years. And we're still working on analyzing the data, but what we found was some interesting results in terms of what are the abstract tasks for people that are doing dimensionality reduction. And found some interesting cases where current tools aren't really doing the job. So this question of why and how do people use dimensionality reduction is going to be a theme that runs through this whole talk. And some of the earlier results from this project, even though it hasn't yet actually seen print, has actually informed a lot of the projects that I'll talk about. So going back to that set of questions that I had, another question is, how do you answer these questions? What are the validation methods that you might choose for these different angles of attack? And so this ties into some work I presented a few years ago on a nested model of visualization design and validation. And in this model, what I proposed was splitting the problem of designing visualizations into different levels. And the idea here is that these 4 different levels have very different, to steal some vocabulary from computer security, threats to validity. So what might go wrong? So one level is trying to understand what domain problem is some specific group of target users, what are they trying to do? And so you could correctly characterize that domain problem, or it's possible to misunderstand the needs of your target users. And so that would be one class of threat to validity. Another is to have an idea of that there's an abstraction of the data, that once you see specifically what a real user is doing, you might say, oh, can I talk about this in a more generic way that crosses different domains? And that's an issue both for their data and for the tasks that they're doing. What's interesting about this is in the visualization domain, it's extremely common to transform the data from one form into another. The data that you're given is often not exactly what you draw the picture of. You might need to do a series of transformations and derive new data in order that then you could actually draw the right picture. So one way you can get things wrong at the abstraction level is if you decide that what you need to show the user is not actually what they need to see, because that's a design choice itself. Then there's a next level down, which a lot of you might think of when you think of visualization, which is how do you actually draw the picture? What is the visual encoding technique you use to create an image, and then what are the interaction techniques that you use to manipulate that? So now it's very possible to do this wrong as well. This gets into issues of, say, perception, and how do you actually draw a picture that's effective for a human brain to decode? And then finally, there's the algorithm level. How do you do all this fast on a computer in a way that's actually efficient in terms of both time and memory? And then, of course, the threat to validity here is something like, well, your code is too slow. Now, what's interesting about splitting things up into these 4 levels is that then you can actually start to guide questions about how do you validate. So let's actually march through. I'm not going to go through in all detail, but let's start with some idea. In a particular domain situation, well, how would you figure out whether you understand the needs of the user? One thing you could do is go off and watch them, right? So actually observe the target users. This might seem obvious, but it's surprising that, in fact, in many contexts, sometimes people don't directly get in contact with the people that they have in mind to use their system. Another question is, how do you figure out if you really understood their task? Well, typically you can't do that right away. You actually have to do some downstream work before you are at the point where you can evaluate that. So moving down one level, how do you figure out if the way you're drawing the picture is correct? Well, one way is to actually try to justify the design a priori in terms of known design guidelines and perceptual principles. You might also do something more downstream after you've actually then designed an algorithm and built it and implemented it. Then you can do some things that are very computational benchmarks, right? You can measure the system time, you can do some kind of computational complexity analysis. And now once you have this working system, there's more things you can do to validate at these upper levels, right? You could do things like analyze the results qualitatively, talk about why an image is actually going to be effective. You could actually do one of these controlled experiments in a lab. So in a user study, you're actually then testing not system time and memory, but human response time and human error. You might do things like actually deploy it to the target users in a field situation and then see, did the way they work change based on the capabilities of this new tool? Are they doing something better? Are they doing something faster? And then finally, an interesting signal is, do people even use it? Once you put it out there in the world, do your target users actually adopt your system? Now, what's interesting about splitting it up into these different levels is you can actually start to make observations. If you're claiming something like, I have a new visualization idiom, a new one of these visual encoding or interaction techniques, it's very hard to convince me that it's the right thing for humans if you tell me how fast your algorithm runs, because that's not actually compelling evidence of that kind of a contribution. Another interesting one is that if you're trying to convince me that you understood the tasks of the users, a controlled experiment in a lab is probably not the right answer for that either. Because in a controlled experiment in a lab, you tell the humans what to do as you measure them with your stopwatch. So testing whether or not you got the task abstraction right is something that's hard to do in a controlled experiment. Now, this is a lot of different methods. No single project will ever actually do all of these. That project would take 27 years to do. It might take 75 pages to document. So a typical research project doesn't really try to attack all of these levels at once. Typically, a paper will pick one of those levels of validation depending on the goal of the system. So in this talk, I'm actually going to pick a set of different methods and projects to talk about in order not just to talk about the projects themselves, but at a meta level to talk about what kinds of validation techniques are appropriate with what kinds of research goals. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on 4 questions. Can we build better dimensionality reduction algorithms? Can we build a system for real people? How do we show the results? And then when do people even need to use this? So I'm going to start out at the algorithm level. And in this talk, I'm going to talk at a fairly high level about things, just to give you sort of an overview, but we'll dive in at least to see a bit of detail. So I'm going to talk about 2 algorithms, both Glimmer and Glint. So let me start out with Glimmer. This is doing multi-level, multidimensional scaling on the GPU. So first, let me define some terms. For those of you who haven't seen this acronym before, MDS stands for multidimensional scaling. It's actually an entire family of methods for doing dimensionality reduction. Possibly confusingly, you'll sometimes see in the literature that it's either a linear method or a nonlinear method. That's because it's actually a whole set of methods. And it started out a lot of the what's so-called classical scaling, where you're minimizing a strain function. A lot of these methods actually use spectral approaches. What's interesting is a whole class of them have actually been classified as so-called Nystrom methods. And what's nice about these approaches is they all basically can achieve linear time algorithms. So some of these are systems like landmark MDS or pivot MDS. One of the limitations we found over the course of this work was there's some kinds of data sets that they tend not to get very good results on. And in general, those data sets where if you have very, very high dimensional data that's sparse, these methods turn out to have some limitations. Another class of methods, the so-called distance scaling methods, they're trying to minimize a different function. Instead of the strain function, they're minimizing a slightly different function called stress. Some of these methods come out of the nonlinear optimization literature. The very, very high quality ones tend to be a bit slow, quadratic methods. SmackOf is the classic example of that. A series of force-directed placement algorithms that started out being quadratic, and then gradually the algorithms got improved and sped up a bit, actually are a stochastic approach that uses the metaphor of an energy model with force-directed placement. And it turns out these actually have some serious problems where they get stuck at local minima in terms of the conversion properties. So our goal with the Glimmer project was to try to get this nice fast speed of the classical scaling methods and get the high quality with sparse data sets of these distance scaling methods. And it was their way we could have the best of both worlds. Now, the strategy on this, we went and looked at a lot of the related work to try to understand if we want to have the parallelism of doing computations on the GPU, what algorithm would actually be suitable for this kind of GPU speedup. And after some deliberation, which I'll refer you to the paper if you're curious about the details, we decided that this stochastic force method would actually be very, very well suited for parallelism. So in fact, we did go off and we built a fast GPU version of that, which was fun. But what was interesting is once we had something fast enough to test it systematically, we found that even though it hadn't been reported in quite this way in the literature, once we systematically tested it on a whole set of data sets, we found that there was a lot of termination problems. So in particular, even if we just try a very simple data set, a grid in high dimensional space, and then try to project that down, in many cases we would have a twisted up grid where before untwisting to become completely flat, suddenly the computation would stop and terminate. So premature termination was the problem here. What we decided to do was to use this previous work as a subsystem inside of a multilevel algorithm, where that was a new algorithm that we designed to actually work well with the GPU and have GPU parallelism. And so one of the interesting hard problems with this was to actually figure out what the right completely automatic termination condition would be. Now again, I'm kind of speeding through a lot of different projects, so I'm not going to go into detail about either the algorithm or anything about the termination condition. I just want to give you a flavor of the kind of results we got and what's interesting in terms of the methodology. So what we did, unsurprisingly, since this paper was published a while back, is we achieved this goal of getting this higher quality with that equivalent roughly linear speed. And here's an example of one of these very high-dimensional data sets. It's very typical if you're trying to visualize sets of text documents, that the document is considered a very, very high-dimensional vector, where every possible word that might be used is one element of the vector. So in this space, the dimensionality of the space is often tens of thousands of these words, and you're also having your data set, which is tens of thousands of documents. So it's very sparse. The dimensionality of the space and the number of items you have in that space are roughly equivalent. In this case, it was around 28,000. And what's interesting is that in the Glimmer results, we're actually able to see some meaningful clusters, whereas in some of these spectral systems like MBS, a lot of things were just collapsed on top of each other, and it was not really able to investigate the structure of that space. Now, what's interesting from a sort of methodological point of view is to think, so how do you measure this system? How do you see whether it's any good? This is very much an algorithmic project, so we're probably going to be doing some benchmarks. So the time one is the easy case, so let me start with that one. Can people actually see this laser pointer in the back? Vaguely? Okay. So we basically had some of the very, very slow older algorithms here, which really aren't speed competitive once the data sets get large enough, and we were able to achieve roughly commensurate performance with these fast Nystrom methods. And this gray line here is Glimmer, and the brown one is this previous work at PivotMBS. What's interesting about this graph, this is actually graphing the normalized stress. So this is this automatic quality measure, which is part of what we're using when we're actually treating this as an optimization problem. And what we see is there's a lot of these methods that actually are higher stress, meaning that there's a lot of error in the layout. It's not actually completely accurately reflecting the higher dimensional structure. And then there's these couple of algorithms, in this case it's Glimmer, and the very slow method of SMATLab that were good enough. The interesting question here is, where did this dotted line come from that I'm asserting is good enough? This actually came from some qualitative analysis of the result pictures, right? Looking at pictures like this versus pictures like that, and trying to say there's structure you can see here that you can't see there. So there's actually kind of a mix in this paper of completely automatic algorithms, metrics, for trying to assess quality, and then having some judgment about what can we even see in those pictures, and can we then make comments about which of these numbers are good enough. Unfortunately, the tricky thing about stress is you don't know a priori ahead of time what the lowest possible stress would be. So these numbers are sort of difficult to calibrate across data sets, which means you can't simply say, oh, we know for all data sets 0.2 is a good number and say 0.8 is a bad number. It really does depend on the data set. So that's just to give you a flavor of this system. Methodologically, what happened here, this was a mix of some very quantitative work with benchmarks, where we were actually doing time and quality measurements. And the interesting thing here was to do some systematic comparison with data sets of different sizes to really try to understand when are the convergence properties going to act up well. And there was also some qualitative judgments about the layout quality. In terms of outcomes, what happened? Well, we were able to understand, oh, for this kind of data set, in this case it was sparse data, these high-dimensional document data sets, we could say, all right, this is where we actually get quality improvements over the previous approaches. So then what? What happened? Well, we released it to the outside world, and then we saw what people did with it. And one of the interesting things, as always, is when users start using your system, they often either find limitations or help you see interesting new cases that no previous algorithms really tried to explore. So one of the cases that we found out about afterwards, which we decided to address in a later algorithmic project, was to think about how to do this multidimensional scaling when the way that you measure distance in this high-dimensional space is computationally expensive. So let me talk you through this. I mentioned that there were now these reasonably fast algorithms for doing multidimensional scaling. And I said, well, you know, we've got the older stuff, actually, the very old stuff in the 50s started out as n-cubed algorithms. Gradually, these times came down. And now there's this whole set of algorithms that are basically linear. So what's the problem? Well, examples like the one I showed you of that tumor data set at the beginning, here's another example of a common benchmark. You've got about a high-dimensional space of 9 dimensions. You've got about 43,000 points. And if you use the older methods, then it takes hours to calculate. If you use these newer methods, it takes about a second. And what's happening here is that the time that it takes to actually compute a distance between 2 points, just think about something like a simple Euclidean distance, is very, very, very fast. Now, there's some other data sets. Here's a data set where you've got about 1,000 images, actually almost 2,000 images, but the way you're computing distances between these 2 points. So you think about a point as being a photograph, many, many pixels, and the Earth mover's distance is a metric that you can compute about the difference between images based on some complex calculations involving color histograms. So you're kind of trying to make a statement about how different they are in the space of possible colors. And this is an expensive computation. So it turns out that all of these methods that just took a second with cheap distances actually still take a long time to compute with expensive distances because the time to calculate a distance between 2 points is actually appreciable. So going back to this question of how do we actually do multidimensional scaling, there's usually 2 kinds of approaches for doing MDS. In one, you have points in space. You actually have a coordinate space. You think about these points as being specified, and then you can calculate a distance using some function. Another common way of doing MDS is that you've pre-computed all of the distances between points, and then you have a distance matrix, where you actually then don't necessarily know how those distances were computed. Some of the speedups on these systems intrinsically require having a coordinate space in order to go fast. For example, one of these previous systems called Glint really relies on having that structure. Some systems handle both, and Glimmer is one example where it can either handle coordinates or a distance matrix. We wanted to be able to make sure that we could handle both of these kinds of cases before doing MDS, and then having a coordinate space, right, points laid out in the plane for the low-dimensional geometry that's the output. So what's interesting was this Beyond the Wild project actually showed us a bunch of real-world examples where distances were expensive. So an easy case for distances where they're cheap is something like Euclidean distance on a relatively small high-dimensional data set, like 9 dimensions. But there's some other examples. For example, if you have to query a database, that's actually going to be a slower thing. This Earth mover distance, where you're comparing color histograms between images, that's also a fairly expensive computation. Even Euclidean distances can be expensive if you've got enough dimensions. If you have 4 million dimensions, that was actually an example out of the computer graphics literature about computing VRDFs. They ended up doing these Euclidean calculations on 4 million dimensional distance data, and then it starts getting expensive to do that. And finally, a really interesting case where it's terribly expensive is if you are eliciting a human judgment. If you ask someone, for example, in perceptual studies, which is brighter, this or that, and you actually query a human, those are very, very expensive distance calculations. It's not just used in things like measuring physical phenomena. Things like marketing surveys are also an example of where there's human judgments elicited. So there's a lot of these interesting examples where distances are actually costly to either get or compute. So again, I'm going to give you a very, very high-level description of the algorithm. We ended up deciding on an architecture where we wanted to say we're going to minimize the number of distances we compute and maybe spend more time computing layouts. So historically, the goal was always spend as little as time possible computing point layouts because that's expensive. Instead, what we said is we're going to try an iterative approach where we start out and we have a very sparse matrix that we start out with, and then try to do a layout, see if the quality of the layout is good enough, and if not, then go back, densify the matrix, add more points to that, thereby doing these expensive distance calculations, and then do the layout again. So we'll end up laying out more times in an algorithm that just did a simple layout, but we won't have to do as many of these expensive distance calculations. Once again, a lot of the interesting questions come down to what are the convergence properties, how do you figure out the right termination condition. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that today, but that's enough to give you a sense of that. So, and what we also decided to do was accommodate a lot of these different approaches to DR. I mentioned there were these spectral methods, the force-directed methods, optimization methods. So we decided to make sure we could handle all of them. We grabbed one of each and actually fit them into this algorithmic framework. To give you a sense, yes, we did succeed in these goals, where we basically said, all right, for the cheap distances, things are going to be much more expensive. Here's our speed results. But for all the expensive distances, we're going to be much, much faster, and then the quality is roughly commensurate with quality. So we succeeded at having these improvements in speed and still keeping high quality. So back to this analysis of methods and outcomes. This was, again, something where we used algorithmic benchmarks to try to see whether or not we succeeded. And the outcomes were interesting in terms of characterizing the data sets where real-world users had unmet needs. In this case, it was with these costly distances. And we were able to say, all right, we've characterized not just the data sets, but the distance metrics where we actually had improvements in speed. So in terms of what's next with these kinds of projects, we're going to keep talking to users to try to understand, are there more interesting use cases that previous algorithmic work didn't really address? Now what I want to do is move on from the more algorithmic work to talk about more of a systems building question. So how do we get people to actually use dimensionality reduction in a way that's going to meet their analysis needs? So I'm going to go from saying, here's a new algorithm that we built, to saying, what are some considerations in designing an entire system? And so we built a system called DimStiller that was trying to provide guidance for people that were doing data analysis with dimensionality reduction. So with DimStiller, it was interesting to talk to the set of people that might use dimensionality reduction. And we end up characterizing, with this VR in the Wild project, some interesting sets of users. So I'm going to think about two different axes. On one of them is, how much do you know about statistics? And this can range from the very low end, which is you don't even know what a mean is, and then this middle ground, which is actually pretty common with a lot of data analysts in the real world, which is, yeah, I was an undergrad, I took a stats course, maybe that was 20 years ago, maybe I forgot a lot of the details. And then finally at the very high end, right, you've got someone who's a machine learning person who knows literature very well and knows everything that's out there. So that's this axis of, sorry, I'm losing my microphone here, this axis of how much statistical knowledge do you have. And there are many people who have very deep domain knowledge. You know, they're doing high-dimensional data analysis for the purposes of a particular domain, whether that's fisheries analysis or something, but they might not be that strong in stats per se. Then there's this other interesting axis, which is what do you know about your data? And this can range from somebody gave me a data set 5 minutes ago, I don't know what it's about, I don't know how big it is, I don't know what the data quality is like, I don't know if there's a lot of noise in the data, all the way to this case I'm calling total information awareness, where you have just spent months analyzing one data set, it's been clean, it's been well curated, you exactly understand it. So what's interesting about this axis is where should we aim in this design space of systems? And we said, all right, if they really don't know anything about stats, we're not going to try to help them use dimensionality reduction. They would need some kind of learning system. So we're not going to aim at that space. And if they've spent months analyzing their data, they also don't need to use visualization to analyze it more. They understand everything there is to know about it. A lot of the previous work has been aimed in this kind of upper quadrant where it's very crisply understood what the user needs to do, and a pretty sophisticated user could then go ahead and use this kind of analysis. And then there are all these people in the middle, what we're calling middle ground users, that don't necessarily know everything about stats and definitely don't know everything about their data. And can we guide them in using the set of dozens and dozens of algorithms that have been presented? How do they decide what to use? So the idea in DimStiller was we wanted to provide two kinds of guidance. One was what we called global guidance, where you've got this very misunderstood data set that maybe has been measured in a verbose way. You want to somehow do some transformations to it and end up with a very compact representation of the data set that's in a lower dimensional space that you can use analysis with. And then this question is, well, what do they do? Should they use one of the variants of MBS? Should they use PCA? How should they show it? What should they calculate along the way? So there's a lot of choices, and we wanted to give them some kind of guidance on what path through this space of possible operations should they take. So what should you do? What should the order be in the analysis pipeline? And then another question is, for a specific operator, in this case I'm just mentioning PCA principal components analysis, what should the parameters be, right? So how many components should you reduce to? What is the meaning of each? So we wanted to give both global and local guidance for these systems. So again, to give you a pretty high-level overview, the main idea with DimStiller was that we proposed an entire set of workflows that people could use that, again, was based on interviewing some of these target users. And there would always be a sequence of operators that they'd be stepped through. And a key idea is that with all of them, they would have some kind of visual local guidance about what to do next. In this case, for example, what we've got here is helping them decide this interesting question of, if you're reducing from high dimensional space down to low dimensional space, how many dimensions should you use? Should we just pick, k equals 2 for 2 dimensions, because 2 dimensions is easy to look at on the plane? It turns out in many cases you can't actually capture all of the variance that you care about. It's been known for a while that if you just look at plots of the error left over as you plot more and more dimensions, a so-called free plot, that might help the user decide how to do that. So in DimStiller we say, well, let's make sure to show that to the user so they have some guidance on this question of how to pick the k, in this case, the number of target dimensions. Just like the problem with k-means clustering is always, well, what should k be? Trying to give guidance for these questions, I think, is part of how these visualization systems can help people doing data analysis. So the methods for this one, this was not trying to say here's a new algorithm, but trying to say understand how people are using the system in terms of workflows. And so we identified a lot of them, and we also built the system to be extensible so that if people came up with new ones, they could also then build them into the system. So we thought of the system as being a dimensionality reduction for the rest of us, built a prototype, and then we're going to see if people use it. Now, this question of guidance is not just for end users. It's actually an interesting question for developers. So this question of how can we give guidance about how do you visually encode, how do you draw meaningful pictures of data, we actually attacked this from two different directions. One was for the developers of a system, and one was for the developers of quality metrics. So I'll quickly walk through a couple of these. So with this project on spatialization design, we were trying to compare some different ways of visualizing dimensionally reduced data. So there's been this approach that a number of folks have proposed, where they take the set of points after they were reduced from high-dimensional space down to low-dimensional space. They think of these, and you could just display those as points in space, as I showed in some of the previous pictures. A lot of systems proposed thinking about these points as creating a height field based on the density of the points, and then actually drawing this height field like a terrain, like you would actually see with real-world geography. And this was something we thought of as a strangely popular choice, because a lot of sort of basic perception research has talked about some of the issues in using 3D displays in contexts where you don't have to. A lot of issues with perspective distortion and occlusion, where it's not necessarily clear that just because you can use 3D, you always want to. And a lot of people made assertions about what were some of the benefits possibly of having these kinds of landscapes, in terms of maybe it's easier to recognize patterns, maybe we can invoke human spatial reasoning. Well, people are familiar with terrains in reality, so maybe these information terrains will also be evocative. So we decided it would be useful to actually test this. So we thought about the abstraction of what kinds of tasks would people actually do with this dimensionally reduced data. We picked the abstract task of search, where people are using some kind of spatial region and doing an estimation task. In this case, for example, the exact thing we tested was estimate which cell in this grid has the most points of some target color. So in this case, the target is blue, and you have to say, of these grid squares, which one has the most blue dots? And you want to say something similar, which of these spatially colored regions, where we got the different colors, actually has the most dots? In this case, the question was the red region. So this is an abstract task that was motivated by some analysis questions like, where in the display are people with high incomes, or, you know, does this area also have high education levels? Or another question would be, does this correspond to a particular work sector? So this would be if people were trying to ask that kind of question. We wanted a task that wasn't so trivial that you could glance at the display and answer it in under a second. So in visualization, we would call that pre-attentive processing. So not something that you can do without thinking at all, without the need for cognition, just perception. But we also wanted it to be a fast enough task that they could respond quickly, maybe within a few seconds or under a minute, as opposed to an analysis task that would take, say, 20 minutes. Because we wanted to be able to actually test a large enough set of people to try to look for statistical significance. And we also validated that this was a reasonable task by doing some piloting in terms of what people were doing in real data analysis situations. So I'm not going to walk through all the results. I'm just going to focus on specifically this question of the points versus landscapes. We actually tested several cases as well. But what we did here was actually test human response time and error rates for things like the points versus the full 3D landscape versus things like contour plots to try to understand, even if you didn't use 3D, but you had large areas of colored contours. So these are three of the cases that we tested. So we thought that points would be better than landscapes, and the answer was yes. They're much better, between 2 and 4 times faster, and much, much more accurate, between 5 and 14 times. If you are going to use these kinds of landscape displays, then the 2D ones were actually more effective than the 3D ones, which is interesting. Often in visualization, if you redundantly encode information with multiple visual channels, like say position and color and size, instead of just one or the other, often redundant coding improves performance. This was an example where redundantly using both color and height actually decreased performance because of all the perceptual problems with using 3D in a case where it wasn't necessary. So people found that, what we found was that people were indeed faster with these two-dimensional landscapes than 3D ones. So this was an example of where we had a research question that was actually well served by doing controlled experiments in the lab. The outcomes here was we had some very specific advice for people that were doing design of these visualization tools about, well, avoid 3D landscapes for dimensionally reduced data because we found that they weren't so effective. And so then we thought, okay, it would be interesting to go off and do more of these studies. In fact, how can we then get more ideas of guidance from user studies? We came across an interesting example where a controlled experiment in the lab was not the right way to attack the problem. We ended up thinking about what are the factors that affect whether people are able to make judgments about separation between clusters. So let me, once again losing my mic. This idea of are clusters separate or not is actually pretty simple to explain, right? Here's an example where, and this is motivated by people looking at scatter plots of data. You know, are these classes mostly overlapping each other, or are they next to each other, or are they actually spatially separate, or even quite distant? So the question is, can we have some kind of measure that would say whether these are good or bad? We are actually motivated by trying to use something like this in that DimStiller system that I just described. So a lot of quality metrics had been proposed for trying to have guidance for data analysis. The question would be if you reduce to, say, more than 2 dimensions, and then you want to actually have a scatter plot matrix of points, could you actually pick which scatter plots in this matrix of all possible pairs of points are the most effective at actually showing, say, some kind of separation, where you could say, oh, some of these are good, these are the only ones we need to show the user, and we could have some completely automatic way of doing this. And a number of papers have been proposed with metrics for this. Some of these have even been validated by user studies. So the goal here is to try to say, all right, if the human's looking at this scatter plot, can they understand what's going on? What are they learning from the layout? And as I said, one of these measures have even been checked. But when we tried to actually use this measure for guidance in a DimStiller-like situation, we had all these situations where the automatic measure said that something was good, and a human looking at it would say, actually, no, this is not a good separation. And so we were trying to understand what's gone wrong with these metrics. We thought they were validated. So we started out by thinking, well, maybe they just didn't do the right user study. Let's think about, is there another interesting one that we could do? And we started going down the path of a traditional user study, where you're looking for statistical significance. You do some computation to decide how many users you need to test, and you have them look at a few data sets. And what we found was that actually the interesting variable here was, were we looking at the right variety of data sets? That the interesting factor was actually the characteristics of the data, more so than the individual differences of the people. So we decided we wanted to flip this and have this thing we call a data study, where a small number of people actually look at many, many data sets, in fact, hundreds of data sets. And so we ended up having a situation where we looked at, in total, over 800 instances of data sets. We looked at about 75 data sets, a bunch of them were real, 30 of them, some synthetic ones. We already had so-called classification, where there was ground truth about the clusters that was encoded with color. We tried 4 different ways of reducing the data, and 3 different ways of visually encoding it. Either as a 2-dimensional scatter plot, a 3D one where you could actually rotate to resolve spatial relationships and occlusion, and then a matrix of scatter plots where you're actually looking at all pairwise combinations of 2D. So just to give you an example of what these quality measures were, here's one of the, there were 2, I'm just going to talk about one for time reasons. Here's one where you're actually judging whether or not a particular point is closer to the centroid for its color than the centroid for any of the other colors. So here's an example where the metric has a high measure. These go between 0 and 100, so it's saying this is pretty good separation between these 3 classes. And the reason is that, say, all of the blue points are closer to the centroid of the blue class than to the centroids of any of the other classes. So, and then here's an example for a particular point where, in fact, it's closer to one of the other centroids than the others. And so we can just go through, do this computation for all the points, and average them, and end up with the number for the entire data set. So I said we were going to have something where a small number of people give judgments about a large number of data sets. Well, how can you do this in a way that's interesting or useful? So there's actually some interesting analysis methods that come out of the social sciences. These methods of coding data. And when I say coding here, I don't actually mean coding as in hacking, writing computer code. I mean so-called open coding and axial coding, where you're basically going through the data set and trying to gradually understand, is there a very small set of vocabulary that I can use that actually captures the structure of this data set? It's typically done iteratively, where you develop this set of codes and then apply them. And then after you've built up these basic codes, you can then try to put them together until you have some higher level structure that you find believable in the data set. So there's some interesting references if this is a method you're interested in using. And these slides, by the way, are online. If people are interested, I'll put the URL up at the end. And so this question was, could we use this method of open coding to try to evaluate when does the metric actually align with human judgment, and if not, can we understand why? So we ended up, for example, with some codes like there's an outlier, or classes have distinctive shapes in the projection, or some classes that should be the same class are actually split in the display, or the points are actually distributed in a fairly equidistant way as opposed to a highly clustered way. Having some headset problems here. So what we did with this method of open and then axial coding is try to build up a set of reasons why these measurements failed, and then map the failures into the taxonomy to understand when do the metrics not work. So I'm not going to walk you through this whole taxonomy in detail. That would be far too long. I'm just going to illustrate a couple of results on the taxonomy to give you a sense of what we found. So one of the most interesting things was the measures actually failed a lot of the time. So about half the time across all the data sets, and well over half the time for the real-world data sets. So the interesting thing when we looked at where they failed was that a lot of the failure cases were actually false positives rather than false negatives. So the metrics giving a much higher answer than a human would give, saying that a data set was good, when in fact humans thought it was not so good. So here's a nice example of one of the failure cases. What we have is a case here where the centroid measure gave a pretty high number, and then a human looking at this data set would say, no, they're all on top of each other. Why is this getting a high value? And the problem here was, when you actually start looking at these data sets, you find that the centroids are pretty close together. These are actually data sets of somewhat different sizes. So the big classes end up on top of the smaller ones, even though by the standards of judging whether these points are closer to the centroid or not, it scores fairly highly. So this was an example of a situation where there was a variance of size. That the size of the projections actually varied quite a bit. It wasn't completely similar. And this was one of the factors that led to them having a problem with the class separation measure. So without walking through all these results in detail, just to summarize, for example, it turned out that this measure, the centroid measure, really only worked if the clusters were pretty round, if there wasn't more than one dense spot, if there weren't a lot of outliers, and if all of these classes had both similar number of points and similar sizes in the projection. And it turned out that, this is a set of assumptions that's not actually true for most real-world data sets, but it was true with the data sets that they had tested on. For the Viz folks among you, this might remind you a bit of the Skagnostics work from Lee Wilkinson. What was interesting was that was another way to try to characterize shapes and scatter plots that was motivated by what can we easily describe mathematically. We were working from the other direction of how do humans perceive, and it's interesting to think about when these sort of meet in the middle. So there were some measures that were the same, like how clumpy are the data sets, are there outliers, sparse versus dense, some things about shape like skinny and narrow. But then there were a lot of areas where, in fact, they were quite different. So that's the high-level description there. So in terms of methods and outcomes, there was this kind of different method of a qualitative data study that we think is an interesting way to analyze, and we'd actually encourage more people to work along these lines. In terms of the outcomes, we actually ended up with this taxonomy, which we both used to understand the problems with the measures that had been proposed, but also as a way to guide the development not only of measures, but also new visual encoding techniques, new systems could be guided by this taxonomy. So then you can go from the question of how can you help people understand how to do a better job with DR, from a different question. How do you understand if they ever should even use dimensionality reduction at all? So An interesting project we had that was sort of a failure case was when we assumed they needed dimensionality reduction and then later figured out that they don't. In fact, this was a project that actually led in part to the development of that nested model to try to tease apart design and validation questions. So there was a project with a group that was interested in doing environmental sustainability, where the application domain was they had a simulator for what would happen if people changed their behavior today. What kind of environmental impact would this have 50 or 100 years from now? And it's basically a simulation model where you've got some inputs about things like do they walk to work or drive, and then outputs like what's the air quality and the water quality like 80 years from now according to the simulator. And this seemed like a pretty classic case where it's high-dimensional data analysis, there's inputs and there's outputs. And so we decided to try to help people understand this data set by doing a fairly classic example of, all right, let's give them a lot of different ways to analyze this data set, including some dimensionality reduction. And what was interesting was that after a lot of work of trying to refine the system and make it better and better, we eventually decided we had the wrong task. They didn't actually need to do this transformation of high-dimensional data down into a low-dimensional space, which is what dimensionality reduction allows you to do. And it turned out there was this interesting problem of the goals. So we were thinking, oh, high-dimensional data analysis. The folks that built the simulator were thinking, we want the general public to change their behavior, and we want to spark discussions within the public about the impact of environmental choices. They did not actually want the general public to sit down and do high-dimensional data analysis to understand exactly how the simulator worked. They actually thought of that as more of a sidetrack than something that was helpful. So as I mentioned, this case of not completely understanding what the task was helped us actually develop this idea of the nested model and the need for task abstractions. And it's this interesting problem, how do you build a system to help people in the world? And it turns out that talking to them is necessary, but definitely not sufficient, because usually they're not introspecting about their needs in a way that directly maps to visualization problems. So we actually thought a lot about this problem of how do you do this sort of problem-driven real-world research, and then proposed a methodology for it. So design studies is a kind of project that's pretty common in visualization, where you really are saying, here's the user's problem, let me try to build a system to address it. And dimensionality reductions is one of many techniques that you might use for that. So this paper on the methodology of design studies, it's an interesting problem. How do you actually design these user-centered projects? 3 of us had done a total of 21 of them over about 10 years, and tried to think about what we had learned. Which things failed, a few did, and what we learned from the ones that succeeded. I'm not going to go into detail on this paper either. We've got some definitions, a framework for doing it, and we actually came up with 32 ways to go wrong and things to avoid. So I'm just going to pick one to illustrate. And it's an interesting pitfall, particularly for people that are used to doing very algorithmic work. And there's these 2 kind of use cases. So in a lot of what I call technique-driven work, which is very common, for example, in the more algorithmic work in Viz, also very common in areas like graphics, is you're in a horse race, and whoever gets the novel result first gets to publish the paper, and everybody else loses. And so then you've got this question of, I want to win the race, and you publish as fast as you can, as soon as you have results that you think are maybe above the line to get the paper in, and that's a very common way of working. And in problem-driven research, we're arguing that's maybe the wrong mentality, and instead you want to think, I've got a piece of music, I've been practicing it, and when do I play it in public for the first time? So the debut of a musical piece. And then your question is not, am I going to win the race or lose the race? You're thinking, am I ready? Have I made this piece good enough that I'm satisfied? Because once I have its public debut, that's not something I can ever do again. So it's an interestingly different metaphor for when you might want to publish papers. Not going to go into detail about the other 31. There's a fair number of others that, if you're interested, we talk about in the paper. So in terms of methods and outcomes, this was interesting in terms of method. This was not a user experiment. This was actually introspecting on what we'd learned after doing a lot of these research systems for 10 years. And also quite a lot of search of the literature about these kinds of problem-driven approaches. So the outcome was specifically giving advice to people about here's how to do this kind of research, and here's some pitfalls that you might avoid. I would actually argue, in my group, we've done a fair number of these meta papers, papers about how to write papers. And I think the field would actually benefit, a lot of fields, from doing these kinds of reflection papers for any kind of research. It's not specific to this sort of problem-driven visualization stuff. So in terms of other stuff, we're still working on the Deer on the Wild project. We'll see where that ends up going. Some other stuff about DR, we've actually been working with journalists for the past several years in the Overview project. And we actually got some funding to basically say, when a journalist started trying to use Glimmer to analyze the WikiLeaks data set, which is a big, complex data set, it was interesting which real-world analysis needs weren't met by that. So we actually have done a number of rounds of deployment and adoption. Some exciting results. One of the Pulitzer Prize finalists actually used Overview for doing their data analysis. And stay tuned, hopefully there will be a paper out on that quite soon. So, to conclude, I talked about some different ways of doing dimensionality reduction from these pretty different angles in terms of methodology. And I think it's interesting to attack things from different directions so that scratching your own itch can actually then lead to progress in one of these other areas. So I find if you do a lot of user studies and evaluation, it helps you decide what to do for your next algorithm. And then grappling with building algorithms and systems helps you decide what studies to run. And then making taxonomies helps you actually think systematically about which things should you do next. Where are the open gaps in the space? And I think it's interesting to find mismatches between the principles that everyone talks about and what real users are doing in practice. And also differences between what's happening in practice in terms of available tools versus what the users actually need. And in order to do this kind of work, you do need to think broadly then about principles in practice and user needs. So if people are curious about more of this, the talk slides are up on the web. There's also a bunch of other stuff on my research group's pages with papers and videos, book drafts, and so on. I want to thank again for funding this. All of the people that I work with, I talked about a lot of joint work from a long list of folks, and also some people in my own group and others for feedback on this talk. So thanks. And I know we're a bit over the original time, but I don't know if there's some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great talk. Are there any questions? We have a couple of more minutes to take questions. And could you repeat the question so that...
Yes, I will try to remember to repeat the question. Way in the back.
So you talked about your DimStiller and how you would guide users towards using certain approaches or using certain algorithms. How exactly would that work? So the user has a bunch of data and pulls it into your program, and the method just shows you however you use it, or how does that work?
Ah, okay. So the question was, how does it actually work with this DimStiller system of providing guidance to the user? Is it data-driven? What is the user shown? So let me actually jump to that one. So the part I didn't go to in too much detail, there's this set of workflows. So what's happening is, for example, we identified 3 really big ones. Verifying that you believe a clustering, whether you think the clustering is actually appropriate, trying to reduce with multidimensional scaling, trying to reduce with principles of health analysis. So for example, if you started out, if the user was able to say, one of these workflows is matching what I intend to do, so it's kind of a task-based thing, then they go ahead and load in their data, and then what the workflow does is it actually sets up a series of steps where specific algorithms and visual encoding methods were chosen automatically by the system based on, once they said this is the workflow I'm interested in, then this was what the system actually proposed and guided them through. So the idea here was, it's not trying to do completely automatic analysis just based on characteristics of the data. That's actually sort of the holy grail. We hope that someday we'll be able to do that. This is based on, once the user says which of these workflows is the best match for what they're doing, then we actually guide them through and say, all right, here's the algorithms you could use in order, and then try to provide this local guidance. So the system was also built so that if people could actually identify their own workflows, then they could load those into the system. So it's basically trying to say, what task matches what you're doing best of this set that we have identified already. Once again, I'm losing my microphone.
Okay, further questions? Okay, I have a bunch of questions, but I will focus on the ones that are probably most interesting for people here. So you talked about this 2D projection, and you had the contour plot and also the 3D landscapes. And you see 3D landscapes a lot when people use dimensionality reduction. What would be the approach? So, and you evaluated that 3D landscapes are not the proper choice. But obviously other fields still use it heavily. The same would apply for rainbow color maps, for instance. So something that the visualization community found to not work, but how to actually make others aware of that. And I think that's...
Yeah, I think it's... So the question for those who couldn't hear was, we talked about a case where we had some specific guidance of don't do this, do that. How do you actually get the word out? If people tend to do things that the research has shown are maybe not such a good idea, how do you actually inform people? Sorry about this slightly satanic headset, not quite fitting. So, I mean, I think there's two answers. And one is to actually give people the right nuanced advice about when to use what. So we're not saying never use 3D. We're not even saying never use 3D landscapes. We're trying to be specific and say, if you're reducing abstract data, then don't use 3D landscapes. You know, the question of how do you convince people to do that? You know, I think the start is to write a research paper, but that's not the end. So, I mean, I think the percolation of results from one specific paper to the rest of the research community and then output and practice is an interesting, deep problem. You know, I think the real answer is very long term. You know, you write textbooks, you try to educate people about the right ways of doing it, you get it into the curriculum so that 20 years from now when people come out, you know, there's... I mean, I think there's some long-term questions, you know, even the question of when should you use rainbow color maps, this is another classic good question. It's actually very legitimate to use segmented, discrete, categorical rainbow color maps, but if you've got quantitative data, then it's typically not making the best of choices. So, I don't think I have a perfect answer to that. I think at least try to broaden the set of people that understand the issues and their nuances. And, you know, visualization is still a relatively niche area compared to, say, writing, right? You know, we have classes where we train people for 12, 15 years about how to write, you know, in English or German or whatever languages. We don't have a lot of visual literacy classes where we talk about how we design visual displays. So unsurprisingly, the first time people try something, they reinvent the wheel and make a lot of mistakes that if you thought about the issues, maybe they didn't do so. So, no problem.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question. Yes, Oliver.
Practical questions for the system like DimStiller. How many dimensions can you practically handle?
DimStiller used the answer in part depends on the different operators actually had different constraints. So for example, Glimmer can handle tens of thousands of dimensions, particularly the GPU version of it. The CPU version is of course a bit slower. But for example, it's not going, the GPU version then is not going to handle huge numbers of points. Like it's not going to scale to over maybe, it definitely won't scale to over 100,000 points for the Glimmer. Some other algorithms would. So basically, you could imagine plugging in a more scalable algorithm at some point. I think the framework itself would follow its needs. We were aiming at not just enormous data sets, so probably, you know, say under 100,000 points, under 50,000 dimensions. So not enormous. More focused on this kind of relatively, certainly nothing that's out of core. And even with the GPU stuff, they're trying to stay on the tester memory of the car.
Okay, so thanks again for this talk. This is the last invited talk that we have this semester, so the next talk will be in October then, and we're happy if you join us again, and let's thank the speaker again. Thank you.